This time of year can be the happiest time of the year, or it can be a lonely time of year. It just depends. And this time of year, for me, there's always a certain voice that I miss not hearing. And that certain voice is my grandmother's voice. Now, my grandmother had this way of using two little, not even words, that she would use quite frequently, but these two little sounds meant so much. So we would go over to my grandmother's house after Danny and I got married and after we had Tally. And Tally was, 15, 16 months she was walking. And we would call my grandmother ahead of time and we would tell her we were coming. And we would get there and we would knock on the door. And these are the two words I miss so much. From the deep, deep depths of her living room, you would hear her go, "Yoo-hoo!" And what those two words meant were, I hear you, I love you, I'm coming to open the door for you. And give me 2, 3, or 4 minutes because it takes me longer these days to get up out of the couch to get there. But just with those two little kind of words, yoo-hoo, it always, even today, just gives me this sense of being loved and being cherished and being welcomed. Now, my grandmother's name was Nan Elizabeth, and when I was named Elizabeth Rochon, and from the time I came out, they called me Shawn, C-H-O-N, a name sometimes I really like and sometimes it drives me crazy because nobody ever pronounces it right the first time. So I was Shawn until I was the summer before I went to kindergarten. I had just turned 5, and I was out in the neighborhood, and this mean old boy that was probably 8 came up to me, and he said, "Your name's Shawn, isn't it?" And that was the first time I'd ever heard my name as being kind of bad. And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Ha ha, Shawn the leprechaun." Now, I didn't know what a leprechaun was, but at 5, I didn't want to be one. And I was horrified by this young 8-year-old voice that was calling me Shawn the leprechaun. And I went straight home, and I told my parents from there on in, my name is Elizabeth. So I went to kindergarten, and the first day of kindergarten, they called me Elizabeth. And I thought, I'm glad they know that my name's Elizabeth. I didn't realize that when you go to public school, they call you your first name on your public records. It doesn't matter what it is. So I went as Elizabeth. The only problem in that kindergarten class was that Karcher started with the K, so I was in the middle of the alphabet. Well, they called the F's, the French's first, and Elizabeth French got to be Elizabeth. And then they called the G's, imagine that, FG, and Liz Goodman got to be Liz Goodman. And so by the time they got to me with a K, I was the 3rd Elizabeth in the class, and she said, "I'll call you Beth." And I'm like, wait a minute, that is not my name. So it didn't take me long to realize I knew I didn't want to be called Beth. Not that I have a problem with the name, but that just wasn't one I had considered. But the real problem came when I had to spell Elizabeth. C-H-O-N was so much easier. So when I hear this story of Elizabeth and Zachariah, which I first heard somewhere around 5 or 6 years old, I have really had this kinship with Elizabeth. And then as I grew older and started to really understand this, I really could relate Elizabeth to my grandmother because my grandmother was unable to conceive too, and her name was Elizabeth. And my grandparents wanted children very badly, And the good news about her not being able to conceive is that she was a kindergarten teacher. And I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, not a place a whole lot bigger than Texas City. And I promise you, every person I ran into, my grandmother taught in kindergarten because she taught so long because she couldn't have children. So she didn't have an angel that called and said, hey, you're going to have a son when she was older. But when she was 36, she did have an adoption agency call and say, hey, we've got a son for you. So as I hear this story of Elizabeth and Zechariah, it just means more and more to me every time I hear it. So yes, Elizabeth was too old to have children, which means that she had gone into menopause and she wasn't supposed to have kids. And at that point in time, that is where a woman's sense of worth came from. You will notice that reading from Isaiah. Did you notice all of the women in there and how most of the readings had to do with childbirth or not having childbirth? That's where that sense came, and Elizabeth was barren. And she had been barren for all of that long time, and so it started weighing on her. And Elizabeth not only had the community saying you should have a child, but she kind of double had it because she was from the lineage of the Levites, which were the priest, and that was the only way she could marry Zechariah, who was a priest, was because she was from the lineage of priests, and priests are supposed to have this upward thing with God, and she was supposed to have children, and she couldn't have them. So she felt really, really worthless. So Zechariah, he gets the lot. Now the way this worked is that we're priestly communities, and when your priestly group were up, then you all put a lot in, and a lot is, most of the time, since paper was so important back then and it was so hard to get, people would go out and they would get a rock, and that rock would signify who they were, and they would put that rock in a bag, and then the bag would get shaken up, and a prayer would be over the bag, and the idea was, when you reached in the bag, whoever did that, whoever rock they pulled out would be who God wanted them to be for that position. And that was the lot. The lot was the rock. So it came for the holy, to go into the Holy of Holies, which the Holy of Holies was set up kind of like this was, and it had a curtain on it, and it's that curtain that tears when Christ dies. And the only people that could go in there were for the priest. And so for you to be the priest of a high holy day was a huge thing. It was really big. And so when you were the high priest of the high holy day, you were the one that went in and lit the incense, and you walked around and spread the incense around, because this is where they believed God lived. God lived in the Holy of Holies. So Zechariah had this huge opportunity to go in on this high holy day and do his incense thing, and he's in there with God in the Holy of Holies, and this angel appears, and this angel says, you're going to have a child, and I want you to name him John, and I know your wife hadn't been able to get pregnant, but this is a really big deal, and this is the one time John could not keep his mouth shut. And John goes, but what, but, and the angel said, Murr. And Zechariah could not talk until that child was born. So Zechariah comes out of the Holy of Holies, and he's trying to tell people what happened, but words aren't coming out. Can you imagine that charades game that night? And so then he goes home, and he's trying to tell Elizabeth. Can you imagine going in there? I mean, think about it. And she's going, what are you talking about? And he's going, so this is the part of the story, though, that hurts my heart. Is she finds out she's pregnant, which is the most joyous thing ever. And those 3 little words there that say, she hid herself for 5 months. Now you would think she would be going out shouting from the rooftops, we're pregnant, we're conceiving, we've conceived, we're going to have this child. The angel came, going to name him John, so excited. 5 months, she's in isolation. Now I'm sure part of it is because it's 5 months before a person usually shows that they're pregnant. Another part is if when you look at it, that's exactly when Mary came to visit Elizabeth. Was right at the beginning of her 6th month. And Mary stays with her until just 3 months, so 6, 7, 8, leaves right as she's ready to have John the Baptist and goes back. So can you imagine how excited Elizabeth was, who's been living with Zechariah, who doesn't have a voice, to be able to have Mary come, who does have a voice, to hear Mary's voice for the first time. And if you remember, as soon as Mary walks in, the baby in Elizabeth's stomach turns. So John the Baptist had a voice before John the Baptist had a voice, saying, this is Christ, to his mama and his cousin, saying, this is Christ coming. So John the Baptist's voice started even before he could say anything, and then he was born. And John the Baptist goes out into the wilderness saying, prepare ye the way. I come and I baptize you with water, but the person coming behind me baptizes you with the fire, with the Holy Spirit. The voice of John the Baptist. And then if you go forward just a little bit more, isn't it interesting that it's the voice of a young girl that says, go ahead and behead John the Baptist. She doesn't even know what she's saying, but her mama wants him beheaded because John the Baptist has the audacity to say, you shouldn't be marrying your husband's brother. You should stay married to your husband. So all the voices around John the Baptist. And then what do? They cut off his head, thinking they have silenced him, and he no longer has a voice. But we know that's not true, because he has cried out loud that Christ is coming, and Christ does come. So I invite you to think about those voices, because they'll come up in the next few weeks. You'll decorate the Christmas tree and you'll remember when you got that particular ornament. Or you'll go through your recipe book and go, oh, I remember how bad it was when we made that last recipe. We're not doing that again. And you think of the voice that says, don't you ever fix that one. There'll be little high shrieked voices that will be so excited that Santa Claus is coming. There'll be a lot of voices that you will hear over the next couple of weeks. And there's a lot of voices that you've heard over your life. You have heard some that bring you nurturing, like my yoo-hoo! And you'll feel some that are just plain mean, like Sean the leprechaun. And there are others that bring compassion and that bring hope, and some that may even bring dread. But before you close your eyes this Advent season, what I invite you to do is to bring up that voice that says, I am the truth and the life, and you are my child, with whom I am well pleased. And all God's people say, amen.